Vamos a seguir con el tema de malezas resistentes. Vamos a invitar para el próximo bloque, la próxima conferencia plenaria sobre este tema, a subir al estrado a Aaron Hager y a Christopher Preston. Ambos van a tratar ahora el tema los amarantos y las gramíneas, dos resistencias para estar muy alertas. Vamos a ir presentando entonces a los disertantes que ahora mismo van a hablar sobre este tema, con la moderación de Martín Marcetti, que queda, por supuesto, para introducir el tema también. Comenzamos con la presentación de Christopher Preston, quien tuvo un doctorado en hizo su carrera en realidad de grado en botánica en la Universidad Nacional de Australia, en la cual también obtuvo un doctorado. Desde 2007 es profesor asociado en la materia Manejo de Malezas en la Escuela de Agricultura, Alimento y Vino. Sus estudios se centran en la evolución, la bioquímica, la genética y el manejo de la resistencia a herbicidas en malezas. Aaron Hager es profesor asociado en el Departamento de Ciencias de Malezas de la Universidad de Illinois. Asistió a la Universidad del Sur de Illinois, Carbondale, donde se graduó como especialista en ciencias vegetales y de suelo en 1991. Obtuvo un máster en ciencias de las malezas en la Universidad Estatal de Michigan en 1993. En 2001 completó su doctorado en malezas y se unió al Departamento de Ciencias de Cultivos de esa universidad en 2002. También es profesor asociado en Ciencias de las Malezas en la Universidad de Illinois. Y a Martín Marcetti, que es el gerente del programa de malezas resistentes de APRESID, quien ya hemos presentado. Martín, adelante, por favor.
Bueno, en esta segunda etapa, como comentamos antes, hacíamos focos en los dos problemas que nosotros identificamos como complejos de maleza más problemáticos en Argentina en el momento, que son los yuyos colorados resistentes, que bueno, en Argentina incluye más de una especie, pero son amarantus. Y luego Chris nos va a hablar de gramíneas, que es otro complejo de especies muy problemáticos en Argentina. Así que bueno, elegimos esos dos temas para este seminario. Así que bueno, empezamos con Aaron, quien se va a enfocar en los yuyos colorados. Él es de Estados Unidos y es el país con más problemas de este grupo de especies. Adelante.
All right. Thank you very much. Beautiful day outside today. This is my first time in Argentina. And yesterday I had an opportunity to travel through the countryside, and two things have struck me so far about Argentina: the beauty of the countryside and the wonderful nature of the people. And one thing I would like to say at the outset, and I've been thinking about this now for several weeks, I have seen football in Germany, and I have seen football in Argentina. Football is better in Argentina. What I'd like to share with you this morning is some of the work that we have actually been able to do now at the University of Illinois with a weed species that is very, very problematic for us. This is Amaranthus palmeri. And this is a species that in many areas of the Mid-South and the southeastern United States, once it has become established, has fundamentally changed farming practices. And unfortunately, as we've learned here in the past several days here in Argentina, this species is actually becoming established here as well. Now, when you look at the species at a seedling stage, it really doesn't look much different than many of the other species of Amaranthus that you have either here in Argentina or that we have in North America. But the problem is, it doesn't stay that stage very long. If you look very closely, this is a photograph that was taken just north and east of St. Louis, Missouri about 2 years ago. And if you look very, very closely, that is actually a soybean field. And this is a population in this particular field that's only been there for a little more than 3 years. And a lot of people in Illinois seem to think that this is only going to be a problem in the south, and eventually it will move its way north. But unfortunately, that's not necessarily what is going to happen, because it has already moved north. And as a matter of fact, one too far. This is a photograph that was taken last year, about 30 minutes to the south of downtown Chicago. So this is certainly a species that's going to give us some statewide headaches and statewide problems. And a while back, I happened to do a very quick scan of the literature, and looking at scientific citations for some of these dioecious pigweeds, or pigweed species that any plants are either a male plant or a female plant. And through the year about 2000, now this may include about 30 or 40 years of the published scientific research, we found about 42 citations for tuberculosis, which is another dioecious pigweed, and only about 9 citations for palmary. But in the period of time between 2001 and 2011, in this 10-year block, you can see what the number of citations did. Certainly increased at a dramatic rate, and I think this is certainly evidence of how important these species have now become. Now, a little bit of the history of palmary. This is actually a species that did not evolve in the Midwestern United States. It actually, as a species, evolved in areas over in the southwestern United States in the Sonoran Desert region. So it's adapted to a very dry type of a climate. And if you look back in herbarium records, most of the records of collections of palmary prior to the year 1900 were made in that general area, in the Sonoran Desert, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. However, I came across a quote from a well-known amaranthus taxonomist, and I thought it was very, very interesting, because he's quoted as saying that it looked to him at the time that there had been a recent and fairly substantial migration of palmary out of that zone or that geography where it had evolved, and greatly moving now to the northeast. And one thing that I found extremely interesting with that quotation was that he actually made that quotation back in 1957. So this is a species, is something that has been on the move now for many, many years. It's not really anything that has happened all of a sudden. Now, this is a distribution map where we know palmary is in the state of Illinois. So any of the counties that are shaded are actually counties that we have confirmed the presence of palmary over the last 3 years. Those counties that are shaded in orange on this slide are populations that we know are glyphosate resistant. The ones that are shaded in blue does not necessarily mean we don't have glyphosate resistance in those populations, but we simply haven't confirmed it yet. And one thing about palmary that makes it very, very difficult to be even able to predict where infestations might begin is simply the seed production. This is a dioecious species, so any plant in the field is either a male or a female. And all the male plants do is produce pollen. All the female plants do is produce seed. And the amount of seed that they produce per individual plant is tremendous, in excess of 500,000, perhaps even 1 million seeds per female plant. And this was work that was published in Cotton, looking at interference of palmary in cotton grown for the full season. And when you look at the seed output, now this is seed output of a palmary female that's grown under a crop competitive condition the entire growing season, you're looking at somewhere about 3 billion seeds per hectare. So a tremendous volume of seed, and these seeds are very adapted to movement. They're very, very small, and they move very, very easily. This is a photograph of a cotton field with my colleague, Dr. Norsworthy, in Arkansas. And this particular cotton field had never had palmary in it before. And so he introduced about 20,000 seeds of palmary in an area of the field just about, maybe 1 square meter in size. And what he was trying to do is actually represent the seed output of a single, maybe just one plant out in the middle of the field that nobody was really concerned about and nobody really cared about. It was just one little female plant, and it wasn't really going to hurt anything. And so 20,000 seeds of a glyphosate-resistant female palmer is not a lot of seed. But he kept hearing from his farmers how the glyphosate-resistant technology kept working for them. They weren't going to do anything different until that technology no longer worked. They weren't going to integrate any other type of herbicide program. And so for the next 3 years, he did exactly what he was hearing his farmers tell him. And all he treated this cotton field with was glyphosate. And so this is the infestation now, after only 3 years. He literally lost this field to production in a period of time of 3 years. And certainly the reason why we're concerned about Palmary is its competitive ability. This by far and away is the most competitive of all the amaranthus species that we encounter in agronomic production crops in North America. Published yield losses, 78% of soybean, 91% yield loss in corn. And folks, I can tell you based on this past year that we worked with this now in the field, these losses could actually be low. We can actually see 100% yield loss in our crops if we're not able to adequately manage a population of Palmary. So what we've tried to do for our farmers in Illinois is come up with some guiding principles and recommendations on how we're going to be able to successfully manage populations of Palmary. And first off is that prevention is always going to be preferred to eradication. And when we say prevention, what we're suggesting is any tactic that will either prevent seed introduction into a field, or unfortunately, if that population is already well established, any tactic that will actually prevent seed production, any further seed production. Because what we tell folks in Illinois is that if we try to go head-to-head against Palmer, if we think we can spray our way to successful management of Palmer, we're going to lose, and we are going to lose big. Once established, these populations' herbicide costs will generally double. In our field work this year on very coarse texture soils, 3 applications of herbicides would be necessary. If we only sprayed once, we never would put a combine in that field. If we would have only sprayed twice, we would have put a combine in there, but it would have been very, very difficult. And so we're introducing this idea in Illinois of a zero threshold concept. The control of Palmary should not be less than 0. So when we find Palmary in Illinois or here in Argentina, what do we know about it from the outset? And first off is that any population that we find, one thing that we do know is that it was introduced from outside of Illinois. The seed had to come in from somewhere. It's not native to Illinois. It's not native to Argentina. Now what we assume, and this is sometimes an erroneous assumption, but what we assume is that the seed likely came from areas of the U.S. where Palmary is already well established. And many of those populations in areas where it's well established are also glyphosate resistant. But unfortunately, what we really don't know with much certainty whatsoever is either the sensitivity or resistance profile of any resistant population. And certainly Palmary is a species that is well known down through history to evolve resistance to various herbicides. You can see the list right here, dinitroanilins back in the late 1980s, the ALS inhibitors in the early part of the 90s, etc. One thing that's very troubling is about this list, if you look toward the bottom of this list, Palmary is doing something very, very similar to what tuberculosis has been doing for us in Illinois over the last 2 decades. And that is it's beginning to accumulate resistances. We're talking about multiple resistance either at the field scale or worse yet at the individual plant level. So for management of Palmary, what we really try to emphasize from the get-go, from the very beginning to the farmers in Illinois who either don't recognize this or really don't believe it's going to be much of a problem for them. It will be. It will evolve over time to be one of our dominant broadleaf species in the Midwest. There's really no single tactic that we can recommend farmers to do to keep Palmary from reducing yield. So much more of an integrated management system. If there's ever been a weed example of a species that would benefit from an integrated management approach, it is Palmary. The more integrated of a system that we can introduce, the greater the likelihood that we are going to have long-term success managing this weed in Illinois. And what we've actually tried to do is come up with the recommendations that are tied very closely with the biology of Palmary. We also tell farmers in Illinois that Palmary does not play by any else's rules. It has its own rule book. Okay? Palmary will not adapt to our farming. We will have to adopt our farming practices to Palmary. And so we talk about things like not only the emergence timing, but what is the duration of emergence of this particular species? Very similar to our other dioecious species in tuberculosis, you never have a single emergence event of Palmary. It's a very, very long and continuous emergence event. We talk a lot about growth rate, and this is where we're going to have problems in Illinois because of the speed at which this plant increases its height. We're talking multiple centimeters per day. Okay? So a little bit more about the emergence characteristic. Again, this is a species that tends to display a very prolonged emergence pattern. We noted our first emergence event at our field location this year on May 8th. I was up there just last week, and we had even more emergence occurring. Honestly, I've lost track, but I'm sure we're somewhere between 12 and 15 different emergence events, unique emergence events for this species at this location this year. But these seeds only germinate from very shallow depths in the soil. If we bury the seed much more than perhaps 1 to 1.5 centimeters deep, they'll never germinate. And previous work has actually demonstrated that Palmary seeds tend to have a higher germination rate than some of our other amaranthus species. And one of the challenges, of course, that's going to be a little bit unique now to Palmary is that these seeds and these plants can actually germinate and emerge before tuberculosis will. But once tuberculosis stops, when soil temperatures are too high to allow any further seed germination, Palmary keeps coming on. And again, it's a species that has evolved in the desert southwestern part of the United States. So this is simply a pictorial representation of what we have seen this year on this site that's only about 35 miles south of Chicago. We planted everything on the 22nd day of May this year. We put on all of our pre-emergence herbicides right after we had planted. 7 days after we had planted, you can almost make out there's a coin right in the middle of that next photograph. It's hard to see, but all those other objects in there on the soil surface are emerged Palmary plants. By 14 days after application, after all of our pre-emergence treatments had been applied, we went back to do the first evaluation. All these pre-treatments had broken by 14 days. By 21 days, we had to make our first post-application, or else this would have been too large to control this population. And you can see in the center, that's 6 weeks of Palmary growth. By the way, there's also soybean planted in that plot. That's one of our untreated comparisons. So based on the emergence characteristics, here's where we start with our management recommendations, and that is be sure to control any existing Palmary plants before you put any crop seed in the ground, either through tillage or effective burn-down herbicides. If we plant into an existing stand of Palmary, it's a very great likelihood we'll have to tear up that stand and replant. And certainly for a species like Palmary, soil residual herbicides are not optional. They're absolutely necessary to effectively manage this population or this particular species. For us in Illinois, our work would suggest that some of the soil-applied PPO inhibitors, things like flumioxazin, things like sulfentrazone, are probably some of the strongest active ingredients that we have for residual control of Palmary. We have to get the timing of the application right. We don't recommend people apply these 30 days before planting. We like to have a very narrow window so that our residual control can last longer into the growing season. Now, the second point about Palmary biology is the growth rate. And this actually is, I guess, nothing short of phenomenal. We've got a species here based on some work that was published out of Kansas State University several years ago, where they compared the growth rate among several different amaranthus species. And I did the calculations and conversions based on growing degree days. And Palmary is a species that can do anywhere from about 6 to perhaps even 9 centimeters of growth per day. And this is one of the greatest challenges that we have because we don't have enough spray equipment in Illinois to be able to cover all the acres in a short period of time. And perhaps this photograph really illustrates this. This is a photograph that my colleague, Dr. Steckel in Tennessee, shared with me. And these are soybeans that were planted into weed-free soil. And I'll emphasize that again, weed-free soil on May 16th. And folks, 13 days later, he snapped this photograph. And the palmary, you can see how tall it is, almost 10 inches tall already. Again, a tremendous amount of growth in a very, very short period of time. So based on that growth rate, our suggestion is to begin scouting within 14 to 21 days after planting. Check the performance of the residual herbicides. If you see the palmary coming through there, do not delay the application of the post product. Don't wait for an additional emergency event to take place. Most of the options that we have to manage palmary are the same ones that we use for tuberculosis. And we also suggest that farmers at this time consider adding another residual herbicide into that field. Tank mix something with the post-applied product to try to extend the residual control a little bit longer. The best way really to manage palmary is to never let it out of the ground. And this is another photograph Dr. Steckel shared with me. The soybean on the right were treated with fomeciphin when palmary was only 7 centimeters. And I forget what happened, but there was a delay of only 2 days. I don't know if the sprayer broke down or what had happened. But at the end of the year, here's the photograph of the field. On the right was treated fomeciphin at 7 centimeters. 2 days later, they came back and retreated or sprayed the rest of the field. So we can lose these populations very, very quickly. Another example, this was fomeciphin and glyphosate applied when palmary was 12 centimeters. This photograph was taken on June 21st. This photograph was taken on July 14th. That is the same field. They had to tear up that original stand and replant it because they could not control the palmary. So further suggestions, and we recommend that fields be scouted somewhere 7 to 10 days after that first post-application. How effective was it? Do we need to retreat if we didn't get complete control of the palmary? How well did the added residual herbicide work? Did we have enough moisture to get it into solution? And certainly if we see control less than 100%, we need to make a second post-application. Now sometimes we could use the same herbicide, sometimes we will need to actually rotate to do something else. And then finally, at the end of the growing season, physically remove any remaining palmary plants before pollination. Because if we don't, we're going to begin to add seed back into the seed bank. And a lot of people, when they give this presentation, they feel like this is a very negative presentation about how bad this is. Folks, it will be worse than what we actually portray it. If we go toe-to-toe with the plant, we can't win this battle against palmary. The way that we manage palmary and the way that we win this battle is on this slide. If we attack the plant itself, we're going to have a significant challenge in front of us. However, the key to managing palmary is to manage the seeds. Now, this was work that was actually done on water hemp or tuberculosis at Illinois. And the experiment was set up on a field block that had a tremendous population of tuberculosis. So in the year 1996, all that seed was added back into the soil seed bank. But after 1996, no seed was allowed to be to reach maturity or be added back into that soil seed bank. And you can read down here about midway through this slide, after only about 4 years, the remaining viable seed in the seed bank was much less than 1%. So again, we put a tremendous amount of discussion and focus on managing the seed bank. The herbicides that we will have to use, the residual herbicides, will be very, very important. The post-applied herbicides will be very, very important. But ultimately, we have to manage the seed and the seed production capability of these female plants, as you saw with the example from Arkansas, can be tremendous. If we let a few of these females go and produce viable seed, we will face these challenges for many, many years. On the other hand, if we can prevent seed from being augmented back into our seed bank for a period of perhaps 3 to 5 years, we will notice these population densities begin to decline very, very rapidly. So just to wrap things up here about Palmary, and we'll certainly try to answer your questions this afternoon as we can. But Palmary, and especially herbicide-resistant Palmary, is a very serious threat for us in the Midwest. And I would suggest it's certainly a species that could be very, very damaging to production here in Argentina as well. Populations have been identified now in many parts of the U.S., obviously here in Argentina as well. Glyphosate resistance will continue to spread in Palmary. This is a trait that can move very, very easily, obviously, as the seed is moved from area to area. But these are also, many of these herbicide resistance traits can also be transferred in the pollen. And the problem, of course, can spread very, very rapidly if even a few of these plants are allowed to remain to maturity in fields. An integrated approach is absolutely critical to successfully manage Palmary. Pre and post herbicides, we will even consider things like tillage. We will consider things like, are there techniques that we can use? Are there new pieces of equipment that we can investigate to even damage seed as it comes from the combine at the end of the growing season? Again, residual herbicides form the foundation of a management program for Palmary. Select them, use the appropriate rate, but again, scouting has to be very, very vigilant because most of our post herbicides are only going to be effective on Palmary plants less than about 7 centimeters. If they're greater than 7 centimeters, control can go down very, very quickly. So with that, I think I'll wrap up my remarks. Again, folks, thank you very much for the invitation to be here and share this information with you. If I can be of any assistance in the state of Illinois, please feel free to contact me at your convenience. So thank you very much.
Chris.
Buenos dias. G'day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here at APRICID. It is a very impressive Congress. I'd also like to thank New Farm from Argentina, who have organised my trip to this Congress and have looked after me extremely well. I'm here to talk about ryegrass, and the slide up there has the names of the members of my research team who work on the management of herbicide-resistant ryegrass. Our work is primarily funded by the Grains Research and Development Corporation. When farmers deliver grain, they pay a levy for research and development. So our work has been funded by farmers. So what am I going to talk about? Really, in Australia, grain production is dominated by wheat. Farms are large, highly mechanised. Herbicide resistance to post-emergent herbicides is very common in grass weeds. Do you want to change that? I've got the English version, unfortunately. You want to change it to the Spanish version? Excellent, excellent. So So your resistance to post-emergent herbicides is really driving our system, and seed set control tactics are used to manage seed banks, and that's how we manage ryegrass. Effective integration of these controls can bring down those seed banks and also make extra profit, and that's going to be the final take-home message, that you can actually make money by managing ryegrass. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Australian agriculture. This is where we grow wheat. We have approximately 22 million hectares of winter crop production and about 4 million hectares of summer crop production every year. 13 million hectares of that is wheat, 5 million hectares is barley, and 3 million hectares is canola. You might also notice that the yields are not very high over most of that area. This is farm size in Australia. In the southern and northern regions, it's about 1,000 hectares of crop are sown every year. And in Western Australia, about 2,000 hectares of crop are sown every year. So farms are large. And farms are, most of that farming is no-till. Ryegrass is the major weed problem across the south and across the Western Australian cropping belts. The problems with ryegrass are that it's very widespread, it occurs in high densities, it's outcrossing, has high genetic variability, and produces a lot of seed. So that photograph, that is first of those photographs, that's actually a crop of barley, but you can hardly see the barley for the ryegrass. So one of the things that, go back. There we are. One of the things that we do as part of our research program is to try and determine the extent of herbicide resistance in weeds. We have been doing this in South Australia and Victoria. That's 2 of our 6 states. This is an area of approximately 500,000 square kilometres that we're working across. Every single one of those dots on that map is a field that we entered at the end of the season to collect weeds from. And we take those weeds and we test them to see whether they're resistant to herbicides. So in that photograph, every single one of those pots in there is from seed from a single farmer's field. If they are brown, they are susceptible to herbicide. If they are not brown, they are resistant to herbicide. So we can determine what the average resistance situation is. And this is what it is. So this shows a number of areas that we grow crops in South Australia, Victoria, and in other states, looking at a range of herbicides that we use. So let's start with hoegrass, which is a post-emergent grass herbicide. Mostly it doesn't work. We're going to look at glean, which is chlorsulfuron. We also use that post-emergence for ryegrass in wheat. It doesn't work anywhere. Axial or pinoxidine was a herbicide that got introduced in 2005. And in 2005, it nearly didn't work. Now, it mostly doesn't work. Select or clethodim is a very important post-emergent herbicide for us, not in wheat, but in our other crops that we use, and it works a bit. Inovix is a combination of 2 compounds that are imidazolinone herbicides for use in clearfield crop technology. It mostly doesn't work. Trifluralin at the beginning is one of our residual herbicides, and we're starting to find places that it doesn't work. So if we look at the populations we collected, there are more than 1,000 farm fields in this diagram here. And what you find is that these populations can have resistance to up to 6 different herbicides. So the question that we get asked is, I don't have any post-emergent herbicides left. How do I control my weeds? That's the situation we're looking at. So the rest of the talk, I'm going to tell you how we go about doing that. So the general rules that we use to manage herbicide-resistant weeds are really quite simple. There are 3 of them. There are only 3 rules. The first one is that you need to reduce your weed populations. You have to have fewer weeds. The second one is that you rotate your herbicide modes of action when you can. That just means you can continue to use those herbicides into the future. And the third one is that you reduce the seed set of weeds to stop that seed going back into the soil. So those are the 3 rules. That's what we want every farmer to do. So how do we do that when we don't have any post-emergent herbicides? We do it by using residual herbicides, and we combine that with stopping seed set. So first of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the issues we've got and the problems we have and why we need to stop seed set. So this is a photograph of a rather good-looking barley crop coming towards harvest, and that will be harvested. It will yield, it'd probably be a 4 tonne per hectare barley crop, but what you can see in it are all these ryegrass seed heads. They're going to repopulate that seed bank because we haven't been able to do anything about them. That's our problem. So how do we do it? We have a range of techniques that we can use. So we can cut crops for hay, we can burn the stubble and try and burn the weed seeds, we can burn windrows, and so we have a range of those sorts of practices. We've actually also developed a range of equipment that we can use to take the seed that comes out of the harvester and take it off the field. So you might bale all the material and take it off the field. We have a seed destructor, and we have a thing called a chaff cart that takes the chaff material out of the back of the harvester and takes that off the field. So there are a range of practices we've got, but we've got another practice as well. And that practice is called crop topping. And I'm going to try and explain to you what crop topping is because it's turned out to be a very valuable practice for us. So we have a problem that at the end of the season, after the crop has been harvested, you might have some, or even before the crop has been harvested, you might have some of those residual ryegrass in the field. So in the case of canola, this is work I'm going to show about canola. We windrow canola, and if we get rain or moisture, we'll get a lot of greening. This is actually canola regrowth, but often that'll be ryegrass. And because there's now no competition, that ryegrass sets a lot of seed. So we did some work to look at how do you try and reduce the amount of seed production in that system. And so we worked looking at what could we do about that. And this is the results of some work we did where we were looking at the amount of seed set control you got by applying glyphosate at that time that farmers would normally windrow. And so we can actually reduce the amount of seed set of ryegrass by up to 75% simply by crop topping in canola. This will be a practice that will be on label for our farmers to use this harvest season. We don't just use it in canola, we also use it in other crops. So the last thing I want to talk about is it's all very well for me as a researcher to say to farmers that you need to reduce your weed numbers, you need to rotate your modes of action, and you need to stop seed set, our 3 rules. But farmers are only going to believe me if we can show that we can do it. So this is a trial that we had. It's quite a complicated trial, but I'll simplify it for you. So what we did is we took a field, and this field was out of control ryegrass. And in the first year, we used oat and hay, which is one of our seed set control tactics. In the second year, because we hadn't made a lot of money off oat and hay, we then went, well, most farmers would then spend not very much money. So we have 3 management strategies. The first management strategy is the cheap management strategy. We used 1 tool, it was a herbicide. The second management strategy was a more expensive management strategy. We used 2 tools, and one of the things that we did was that we started employing some of the new residual herbicides that we've actually developed in Australia to help manage our ryegrass. And the third one is where we went all out, and we used crop topping, that crop topping practice I talked about, whenever we could. So I just want you to think of those 3 strategies as being the easy strategy, the middle strategy, and the hard strategy. So that's the trial. The products are there, but just want to focus about the trial itself. So this is the results out of that trial. This is how it all worked out. So we started off with a seed bank. So 5,000 ryegrass seeds per metre squared in the soil. 5,000. Okay, that is going to be something that you could not actually harvest a crop from. We ran that down in that first year by 85%. So we reduced our population by a large amount in the first year. But then when we went back and decided we were going to take it easy, we were going to do that easy strategy, our seed bank went straight back up again. That easy strategy never works. When we went with the slightly more difficult strategy, so management strategy 2, we kept the seed bank the same. And you might think that that's actually quite, you've got your seed bank down and you can maintain it. And some of our farmers would take that attitude. But the one that when we went for the really more difficult and more complex strategy, we started running that seed bank down to really, really low numbers. Now those numbers up the top there, those lambda is the ratio of seeds that we had at the end of the trial compared to seeds that we had at the beginning of the trial in the seed bank. So where lambda is close to 1, it means we haven't been effective. Where lambda is close to 0, it means that we're running that seed bank down, and that's what we want to do. So how did that look? Well, this is one of the crops in that rotation. This is field peas, and you can see in the management strategy 1 that we've got a little bit of ryegrass in our field peas. That's not too bad. You might think that that's not really very bad, but that ryegrass all set large amounts of seed. And our farmers now have an attitude that 1 ryegrass plant setting seed is 1 ryegrass plant too many. The bottom one is our management strategy 3, and you can see that we've got hardly any ryegrass setting seed in that. And that's actually how we managed to drive our seed bank down. We reduced our weed populations and we stopped seed set. So a combination of effective residual tactics and stopping seed set. But that's all very good, you say. You know, you want me to spend more money to manage my ryegrass. Am I going to get that money back? And this is the question that farmers always really want to know. Am I going to make a profit? So we took those trials, we harvested them, and we worked out how much we were spending for weed control and how much money we were making. So this slide here shows the grain yield. of those 3 management strategies. And you can see that as we worked harder, had more tactics in our management strategy, we produced more grain. Okay? And that's good. But it's only good if you're actually making more money. The numbers on top of the bars there are the amount of extra dollars, these are Australian dollars, per hectare that the farmer made by adopting that strategy compared to using the cheap strategy. So adopting management strategy 2, which got our numbers down and quite reasonable, and we got extra yield, only made us an extra $130 over 3 years. That's $40 per hectare per year. That's all it did. But when we ran those weed numbers down to very, very low levels, we made an extra $540 per hectare over that 3-year period. So even getting to a point where a farmer would say, well, that might be okay, by spending some more money with the right tactics, running the numbers down, we can actually make a lot more money. And so this is where we're suggesting that ryegrass management in Australia is headed. We are taking those 3 rules and applying them. So the farmers now, because they don't have post-emergent herbicides, they use effective residual herbicides, they are stopping seed set, and if they do it right, they are making more money. So I'm going to finish there, and muchas gracias.
Muy bien, le agradecemos entonces a los 2 oradores, a Christopher Preston y a Aaron Hager. Y ahora Martín Marcetti va a poder moderar preguntas que ustedes pueden haber hecho al teléfono de preguntas a través de los mensajes de texto que van a aparecer en pantalla en instantes nada más.
¿Pueden traerle auriculares para la traducción?
Sí, ya le ponemos auriculares a Christopher.
Bueno, mientras tanto quería mencionarles que durante el día habrá talleres referidos a estos temas, tanto sobre manejo de amarantus, manejo de gramíneas resistentes, también el tema de cultivos de cobertura, y también los expositores estarán presentes en diferentes stands. Chris estará en el de NUFAR, Aaron en el de FMC, así que bueno, por si quieren después seguir hablando con ellos durante el congreso. Bueno, para Aaron nos preguntan qué controles utilizan en Estados Unidos además de los químicos para amarantus y cuáles son estos métodos alternativos de control.
We're still very, very heavily dependent upon herbicides by a great large margin. However, because of what we see with the stacking, the accumulation of resistances in our amaranthus species, fairly similar to what Dr. Preston was talking about in the lowlium problem in Australia, we're looking at doing alternative practices. Things such as using a cover crop system, a cover crop sown in the fall of the year and allowed to grow longer into the spring of the year in order to try to suppress the amount of weed seed germination and ultimately plant emergence. We do use some mechanical tillage. We have seen a fairly good shift, well, a dramatic shift, I guess, in acres that had not been tilled for several years, with people looking to try to manage the seed bank by burying the seeds too deeply for them to germinate. Inter-row cultivation. The other day I was driving back from our research site and actually saw the farmer in the field and he had a weed hook in his hand, manually removing any existing weeds. So we still continue to use a lot of herbicides. We can use these effectively, but we have to get past our mindset in Illinois that weeds are just something that we can simply control. We really have to think about all the different techniques that we have at our disposal that we can better adequately manage the weeds. And again, really trying to focus especially on these amaranthus populations to how do we manage these seed banks more effectively.
Vemos si hay alguna otra pregunta. Para Aaron también, le pregunta qué herbicida es más residual, si sulfentrazone o flumioxazin. Espero que se lo puedan traducir bien.
We've actually seen very good residual activity out of both of those products. Obviously, they're different active ingredients. They have different rate structures on their label. Typically, from our work down through the years, they've been very comparable. In some cases, we do tend to see a little bit longer persistence on the Amaranthus species with some of these sulfentrazone-containing products that we apply. That being said, again, regardless of which herbicide that we apply, again, pay attention to the label recommended rate by the soil texture. We also encourage farmers not to simply make the application and assume from that point on everything is going to work. Much of our pre-emergent herbicide is applied after we plant, and we cannot mechanically stir that into the soil solution. So we're very, very dependent upon timely precipitation. If we don't get the precipitation we need, very few of our active ingredients perform as they could.
Para Chris, ¿qué producto preemergente recomendaría para el manejo de las gramíneas?
Well, in Australia we have some new, to us, active ingredients for ryegrass control, plus we have some old compounds. And one of the things that we've been working on over the last 7 years now is developing new herbicide products for ryegrass control. Our best current product is pyroxasulfone. This is a new active ingredient. It was first registered in 2012 in Australia. It's probably been the only herbicide in recent memory that that's happened to. It's extremely effective, but where growers want more control, what they're doing is they're adding other pre-emergent herbicides to it. The one we've been using is triolate. You might know triolate as a weed herbicide. For us, we're using it as a ryegrass herbicide as well. And there's some interesting reasons that we can make that work that probably don't have time to go into now. So that's one strategy, but another strategy that we've got growers doing is to use the pyroxasulfone and then to come back early post-emergent with a residual herbicide. In this case, we use something that's water-soluble, so that's prosulfocarb plus S-metolachlor. And that's also very effective. So the actual one that you would choose is a bit dependent on the circumstance and the weed you're chasing. But we would argue that what we do in Australia now is we don't use one. We use more than one because we need to reduce our weed numbers as much as possible, because our only other option in wheat to do anything about weeds is at the end of the crop.
Para Aaron, pregunta si en Estados Unidos de qué forma se traslada la semilla de palmera de un estado a otro.
We really don't have enough time to make that list. We have seen palmera seed move in ways that 5 years ago we never even would have imagined. About 3 years ago, I was traveling back in my hometown and happened to just take a drive through some of the farm areas that we used to farm when I was a youngster. And all of a sudden, it was one of those moments where you're driving along and through your peripheral vision, did I really see what I thought I just saw? And I backed up and there were several plants of palmera. And it was a strange situation because they were only in a corner of the field. And by corner, I'm talking probably an area of about, maybe 3/4 of a hectare. But that was the area of a field. We had a center pivot on that particular field, and that was the area that the center pivot, the gun on the end, could not reach. And so I knew who farmed that field, and I went to ask them about that and discovered that they had actually enrolled that portion of that field into one of our government set-aside programs. And part of the stipulation for enrolling that was that it had to be seeded down in some kind of a cover. And so we tracked down the source of the cover crop seed, and it was a species composition of about 5 or 6 different species. One of those species happened to come from the state of Texas, where palmaria is very well established. Now, we're certainly not trying to lay blame on any particular company or any particular source, but what we do know is that the retailer who had purchased that seed had actually used the same seed lot on about 7 or 8 other farmers in that general area. They went back and looked at all those fields, and every one of them had palmaria in it. We looked at some other situations where it can move as a contaminant of certain types of livestock feed. For example, if gin trash from cotton is used, we have seen seeds that have been transported long distance that way. A lot of speculation that migratory birds can actually move the seed also. So, weed scientists who come from, other states to look around may be inadvertently tracking some of the seed back with them on their clothing or their attire or their shoes. So, very, very small seed, very, very mobile.
¿Cuál progresa más en Estados Unidos, el palmeri resistente al glifosato o al grupo de inhibidores de ALS? Y es la última.
We see both types of resistance, both glyphosate and the ALS inhibitors. Whether one is more common now than the other, honestly, I can't say to that. What I can say with a higher certainty is that if we look at our other dioecious species in tuberculosis, resistance to the ALS inhibitors in tuberculosis is common. As a matter of fact, it's fairly uncommon to find a sample of tuberculosis that is still sensitive to ALS herbicide. We find those occasionally, but by far and away the vast majority of our populations of tuberculosis have ALS resistance. Again, the glyphosate resistance issue, we will see more and more evolution of resistance to glyphosate in palmari. We suspect that much of the palmari also has ALS resistance, although we have not done near the amount of screening work for that type of resistance as we have for glyphosate.
Bueno, entonces con esto terminamos el panel. Me quedo con una frase de Chris o con un slide que mostró donde el manejo más complejo era el que más ganancia dejaba, y creo que eso es lo que hoy nos está pasando en Argentina. Venimos de una situación de hipersimplificación y debemos complejizarlo porque el sistema nos obliga. Estamos manejando un sistema de producción y no simplemente una máquina, así que será cuestión de ponerse a trabajar, ponerle cabeza, horas y dinero para que el sistema siga funcionando y podamos convivir con las malezas. Nada más, agradecemos mucho a los disertantes y a ustedes por haber participado.